The Medici family name, now synonymous with Renaissance Florence, originally belonged to a clan from the Mugello Valley in Tuscany. Historical records place their earliest roots in the 12th century, where they were modest farmers and small-scale landowners. The family's name, Medici, meaning doctors in Italian, may have referred to an ancestor who practiced medicine or apothecary work, though later generations preferred to reinterpret their title as one of noble service to the community. Florence at this time was not yet the cradle of the Renaissance. It was a fiercely independent city-state, locked in political struggles between the Guelphs, who supported the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. The Medici were staunch Guelphs, a choice that would help them in some eras and nearly ruin them in others. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Medici began engaging in the wool and textile trade, which was Florence's primary economic engine. The Arte della Lana Wool Guild was not only a commercial organization, but also a political institution, and membership brought influence. Wool production meant not only weaving, but also complex financial arrangements with suppliers, dyers, and shippers, skills that would naturally lead the Medici toward banking. It was through the Arte della Lana that the Medici began to accumulate their first fortunes. They also learned the art of strategic marriages, aligning themselves with other merchant families, expanding their reach and credibility. The real turning point came in the late 14th century with Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, 1360–1429, often considered the true founder of the family's fortune. Giovanni was shrewd, cautious, and understood that power in Florence came from economic stability more than titles. In 1397, he officially founded the Medici Bank, which would become the most respected financial institution in Europe for much of the 15th century. The bank was innovative in its operations, using branches across Europe, in Rome, Venice, Geneva, London, and Bruges, connected through a network of bills of exchange, allowing merchants and rulers to move money without physically transporting gold. Giovanni also cultivated close ties with the papacy, becoming the official banker to the Holy See, a relationship that was immensely profitable and politically advantageous. Florence in the early 15th century was officially a republic, but its political life was turbulent. Rival families like the Albizzi and Strozzi often held sway in government. Giovanni was cautious in politics, avoiding open confrontation, but he subtly placed allies in important positions. He also engaged in philanthropy, financing public works and endearing himself to common citizens, which in turn gave the Medici a loyal base of popular support. His son Cosimo de' Medici, 1389–1464, inherited not just wealth, but an intricate web of alliances and enemies. Cosimo proved to be one of history's great political tacticians. He understood that in Florence, open tyranny was unacceptable. Influence had to be exercised subtly. While he never took formal titles like duke or prince, he effectively ruled Florence behind the scenes for decades. His enemies tried to topple him. In 1433, the Albizzi family managed to have Cosimo arrested on charges of treason. His wealth, however, bought him an exile instead of execution, and within a year, popular and political pressure brought him back. Upon his return, Cosimo consolidated his position, exiling many of his rivals in turn. Cosimo's reign coincided with the flowering of early Renaissance culture. He financed the rebuilding of the San Lorenzo Church and commissioned the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, who would also build Florence's most famous landmark, the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Duomo. Cosimo's patronage extended to artists, scholars, and humanists, including Donatello and Marsilio Ficino, helping to revive classical learning. His banking empire continued to grow, serving kings, popes, and merchants, but Cosimo always remembered to use his resources for public benefit. This earned him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, upon his death in 1464. When Cosimo de' Medici died in 1464, leadership of the family passed to his son Piero di Cosimo de' Medici, nicknamed Piero the Gouty due to his chronic illness. Piero's political style was more rigid than his father's, and though he managed to maintain Medici dominance, his reign was brief. In 1469, Piero died, and his 20-year-old son Lorenzo de' Medici 1449–1492, stepped into the role. Lorenzo was not just a political leader, he was a poet, philosopher, diplomat, and an embodiment of Renaissance ideals. His charisma and intellect earned him the nickname Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Though not all contemporaries used it with affection, his enemies saw it as proof of arrogance. Lorenzo understood the symbolic power of art and learning as much as his grandfather Cosimo did. Under his patronage, Florence became the undisputed cultural capital of Europe. He supported artists like Sandro Botticelli, who painted The Birth of Venus and Primavera, and a young Michelangelo Buonarroti, whom Lorenzo took into his household as a sort of adopted son. His influence extended beyond art into philosophy and science. Lorenzo backed the work of humanist scholars such as Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato's works into Latin, helping to revive classical philosophy. He also encouraged new forms of literature and civic thought that shaped Renaissance intellectual life. Florence's palaces, gardens, and churches reflected Medici taste. The family understood that art was both a public good and a subtle form of propaganda, reminding citizens of the Medici's cultural leadership and benevolence. Despite Lorenzo's immense popularity, Florence was full of rival factions. The Pazzi family, wealthy bankers and bitter Medici rivals, hatched a plot in 1478 to overthrow Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano. The conspiracy had powerful backers: Francesco de' Pazzi, Archbishop Francesco Salviati, and, most shockingly, Pope Sixtus IV, who resented Lorenzo's influence in both banking and politics. On April 26, 1478, during High Mass in Florence's Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, assassins attacked the Medici brothers. Giuliano was stabbed to death, but Lorenzo, though wounded, managed to escape into the sacristy. The murder inside the sacred space shocked Florence. The Florentine public rose in fury. Conspirators were hunted down. Several were hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio, their bodies swinging as a warning. Archbishop Salviati himself was executed, a move that infuriated the Pope and led to war between Florence and the Papal States. Lorenzo's diplomacy eventually resolved the crisis, but it cemented his reputation as a shrewd survivor. Lorenzo's skill was not limited to Florence's internal politics. He was also a master of international diplomacy. The late 15th century was a period of volatile alliances among the Italian city-states, Milan, Venice, Naples, and the Papal States, and Lorenzo maintained a delicate balance, preventing Florence from being swallowed by more powerful neighbors. One of his most famous achievements was his personal visit to Naples in 1479, where he negotiated directly with King Ferrante I, risking his life to secure peace. This daring act preserved Florence's independence and ensured Lorenzo's place as a respected statesman. Ironically, while the Medici reached their peak of political and cultural influence under Lorenzo, the Medici Bank began to decline. Mismanagement in some branches, bad loans, including to monarchs who never repaid, and the family's growing focus on politics rather than banking eroded profitability. By the time of Lorenzo's death, the bank, once the foundation of Medici power, was only a shadow of its former self. Still, Lorenzo's vision extended beyond financial profit. He believed the Medici's legacy would be measured not only in gold, but in art, architecture, and the civic spirit they fostered. Lorenzo died in 1492 at the age of 43. His passing was mourned throughout Florence and beyond. Many saw it as the symbolic end of Florence's golden age. Within just a few years, the city would be plunged into political and religious upheaval, with the rise of the fiery Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola and the French invasion of Italy. The Medici's hold on Florence weakened, and they would soon face exile once again. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, his eldest son, Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Piero the Unfortunate, inherited both the prestige and the problems of the family. Unfortunately for Florence, Piero lacked his father's political skill. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy, marching down the peninsula with the intention of claiming the Kingdom of Naples. As Charles approached Florence, Piero made a series of humiliating concessions to the French, ceding fortresses, gold, and territory. This infuriated the Florentine people, who rose in revolt and forced the Medici into exile. Into the power vacuum stepped Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose fiery sermons condemned the corruption of Florence, the excesses of the Renaissance, and especially the Medici. Savonarola briefly transformed Florence into a theocratic republic famous for the Bonfire of the Vanities, 1497, where citizens burned books, art, and luxury items. But his reign was short-lived. By 1498 he was excommunicated and executed. The Medici, however, would spend the next 18 years in exile, working to regain their influence. The Medici's return to prominence came not through Florence's gates, but through Rome's altars. Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had been made a cardinal at the age of 13. In 1513 he was elected Pope Leo X, the first Medici pope. Leo X was a true child of the Renaissance. His papacy was marked by extravagant spending, lavish patronage of the arts, and a taste for spectacle. He commissioned works from Raphael, expanded St. Peter's Basilica, and continued the Medici tradition of supporting scholars and humanists. However, his papacy is also remembered for a decision that would have earth-shattering consequences. To fund his grand artistic and building projects, Leo authorized the sale of indulgences. This policy became one of the main grievances that spurred Martin Luther to post his 95 Theses in 1517, igniting the Protestant Reformation. Leo underestimated the movement's power, reportedly saying, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." The religious and political landscape of Europe would never be the same. The Medici papal dynasty continued with Giulio de' Medici, an illegitimate son of Lorenzo's brother Giuliano. In 1523, Giulio became Pope Clement VII. His reign was far less secure than Leo's, marked by political miscalculations and the shifting alliances of the Italian wars. Clement faced one of the most devastating events in Renaissance history, the sack of Rome in 1527. Troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, many unpaid and mutinous, stormed the city, looting and killing with such brutality that Rome's population was decimated. The sack effectively ended the High Renaissance in Rome and was a humiliation for Clement. Meanwhile, back in Florence, the Republic had once again expelled the Medici. It was only with the help of Charles V, as part of a political bargain, that the family was restored to power in 1530. The real shift from merchant oligarchs to hereditary monarchs came with Cosimo Prince de' Medici, 1519–1574. In 1537, after the assassination of the young Duke Alessandro de' Medici, possibly by a cousin, the Florentine elite sought a replacement they thought they could control. They chose the 17-year-old Cosimo, believing his youth and inexperience would make him pliable. They were wrong. Cosimo quickly consolidated power, crushed opposition at the Battle of Montemurlo, and began transforming Florence from a republic into a centralized state under his personal control. In 1569, Pope Pius V granted him the title Grand Duke of Tuscany, marking the Medici's full transition from bankers to sovereign rulers. Cosimo I was a keen patron of both the arts and sciences. He sponsored the work of Giorgio Vasari, who created the Uffizi, originally administrative offices, later one of the world's greatest museums, and documented Renaissance artists in his lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects. Cosimo also supported scientific endeavors, laying the groundwork for a Medici tradition of patronizing astronomers, cartographers, and natural philosophers. His successors would later support Galileo Galilei, who named Jupiter's largest moons the Medicean stars in their honor. After Cosimo I, the Medici Grand Duchy passed to Francesco I, 1574–1587, who was more interested in alchemy and science than politics. The court became a center of experimental inquiry, but political influence waned. His brother and successor, Ferdinando de' Medici, 1587–1609, was more effective politically, restoring Tuscan prosperity and strengthening the navy. Ferdinando sponsored trade and built the Medici fleet, protecting merchant ships from Ottoman and Barbary corsairs. The Medici continued to intermarry with Europe's elite, linking themselves to French royalty. Marie de' Medici became Queen of France and mother of King Louis XIII and other powerful houses, which extended their influence far beyond Tuscany. By the late 17th century, the Medici were no longer the fierce political strategists of Cosimo il Vecchio or Lorenzo the Magnificent. Tuscany had become more stable, but also more stagnant. The Grand Dukes of this era often preferred courtly ceremony, art collection, and personal leisure to the cutthroat politics of earlier generations. The Medici Grand Duchy still held sway over Florence and much of Tuscany, but the balance of power in Europe had shifted. Major continental conflicts, like the 30 Years' War and the rise of centralized nation-states such as France and Spain, overshadowed the influence of smaller Italian states. Ferdinando II de' Medici is remembered less for military conquests and more for his support of science during a pivotal moment in history. He and his brother, Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici, maintained the family's tradition of scientific patronage, offering protection to Galileo Galilei after the astronomer's condemnation by the Inquisition. The Medici court became a hub for intellectual exchange, hosting mathematicians, physicists, and artists. However, this intellectual vitality could not disguise the fact that Tuscany was slipping into economic decline, its population stagnating, and its agricultural economy unable to compete with the new global trade routes dominated by Spain, Portugal, and later the Dutch and English. If earlier Medici rulers had been bold, flamboyant, or even Machiavellian, Cosimo III de' Medici was pious, rigid, and deeply conservative. His reign lasted over 50 years, one of the longest in Medici history, but it was also one of the most economically and politically stagnant. Cosimo III was obsessed with moral reform, imposing sumptuary laws that restricted dress, public behavior, and even food consumption. While he saw himself as a moral guardian, many contemporaries viewed his policies as oppressive and out of step with the cosmopolitan culture of earlier Medici rule. Internationally, Cosimo III's policies isolated Tuscany. He avoided military alliances and made few moves to expand influence abroad. This caution, combined with poor economic management, left the state weak and dependent on the goodwill of stronger powers. By the early 18th century, the Medici faced a critical problem. There was no robust male heir to continue the line. Cosimo III's son, Giangastone de' Medici, was uninterested in marriage and had no legitimate children. His elder sister, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, was the last of her line and, as a woman, could not inherit the Grand Duchy under prevailing succession laws. The European powers, always ready to intervene in Italian affairs, began maneuvering to claim Tuscany once the Medici line ended. The War of the Spanish Succession and subsequent treaties decided much of the political fate of Italy, and by the 1730s it was agreed that upon Giangastone's death, Tuscany would pass to the House of Lorraine. Giangastone de' Medici was a reluctant ruler. More comfortable in the private salons of scholars and artists than in the throne room, he inherited a state in decline. His reign saw few major projects or reforms, though he did reverse some of his father's strict moral laws and was considered more tolerant in religious matters. By the time of his death in 1737, Florence was no longer the glittering beacon of the Renaissance, but a quiet provincial capital. The once mighty Medici Bank had long since collapsed, and the political ambitions that had placed popes and queens on Europe's thrones were a distant memory. With Giangastone's death, the male Medici line was extinct. Power passed to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, future Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, husband of Maria Theresa of Austria. Yet the Medici name did not vanish quietly, thanks to Anna Maria Luisa. Anna Maria Luisa, the Electress Palatine, had no heirs but understood the importance of her family's cultural legacy. In 1737, she signed the family pact Patto di Famiglia, which bequeathed the Medici art collections, libraries, and treasures to the city of Florence on the condition that they remain there permanently. This single act ensured that the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace collections, and countless other works of Renaissance art stayed in Florence rather than being scattered across Europe. In this way, Anna Maria Luisa preserved the Medici legacy for future generations and secured their place in history not just as rulers, but as cultural benefactors without equal. The Medici's most enduring contribution was not just in politics or finance, but in their role as patrons of the Renaissance. They understood, long before modern governments and philanthropists, that culture could be a tool of soft power, shaping how a state was perceived both at home and abroad. From Brunelleschi's dome crowning the Florence Cathedral to Botticelli's mythological masterpieces, from Michelangelo's David to Galileo's telescopes, the Medici funded the creations that defined an age. Their influence transformed Florence into the artistic capital of Europe, a magnet for painters, sculptors, architects, philosophers, and scientists. Without the Medici's sustained patronage, the Renaissance might have taken a very different shape, or perhaps never reached such heights in Florence at all. Politically, the Medici were innovators in the art of ruling without appearing to rule. For much of the 15th century, they maintained Florence's republican institutions, while effectively controlling appointments, votes, and policies through patronage and personal alliances. This system allowed them to wield power without the backlash that an outright monarchy might provoke, at least until their transformation into hereditary dukes in the 16th century. Their methods, subtle influence, control of key offices, generous public works to win popular favor, would inspire political thinkers and rulers for generations. Even Niccolò Machiavelli, who often criticized Medici dominance, understood and respected their mastery of statecraft. Through the papacies of Leo VI and Clement VII, the Medici left their imprint on the Catholic Church at a pivotal historical moment. Their papal courts were centers of humanist scholarship and artistic patronage, but their political missteps also intersected with seismic religious change, particularly the Protestant Reformation. While Leo VI's indulgences became a flashpoint for Martin Luther, they also financed the creation of St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most iconic religious structures in the world. Clement VII's reign, marred by the sack of Rome, nonetheless marked a transitional period where the Church grappled with its political and spiritual authority. The Medici were also notable patrons of science. Their support for Galileo Galilei was more than symbolic. By naming Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars, Galileo acknowledged the family's role in enabling his research and protecting him, at least for a time, from the full force of the Inquisition. The Medici court became a center for cartography, physics, astronomy, and natural history, housing collections of instruments and specimens that reflected the curiosity of the age. In this way, they bridged the worlds of art and science, recognizing both as expressions of human potential. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici's family pact was an act of cultural foresight that preserved the treasures of the Renaissance for public enjoyment. By binding the Medici collections to Florence, she ensured that the city would remain an unparalleled repository of art and history. Today, the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and the Medici chapels draw millions of visitors each year, direct beneficiaries of her decision. This act also cemented the Medici's image as stewards of culture, even in their final chapter, reframing their legacy from political rulers to cultural guardians. In the centuries since their fall, the Medici have been romanticized, vilified, and endlessly reinterpreted. Historians see them as shrewd political operators. Artists and writers portray them as Renaissance patrons of genius. Popular culture often frames them as a dynasty of intrigue, ambition, and excess. From academic histories to television dramas, the Medici continue to fascinate because they embody the contradictions of the Renaissance: wealth and art alongside ruthless politics, piety and corruption, public generosity and private ambition. The Medici rose from humble wool merchants in the Mugello Valley to become dukes, popes, and power brokers of Europe. Over nearly 400 years, they navigated the volatile currents of Italian politics, banking crises, foreign invasions, and religious upheavals, not always without loss, but with a resilience that allowed their name to endure. Their true monument is not a palace or a title, but a city transformed. Florence, its skyline, museums, libraries, and spirit, is their legacy. And while their political power is long gone, the Medici remain alive in every canvas painted under their patronage, every stone laid by their architects, and every visitor who walks the streets they once ruled. They remind us that while power fades, culture endures, and that is perhaps the most lasting empire of all.